Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to this special session of Marcellus webinar. It's yet another author, but a special one at that. I don't think we've done something with an author with this subject for a book. So it's our pleasure to host Deepak Jayaraman with us this afternoon. I've also got my colleague Saurabh Mukherjee. Deepak's background is perhaps the highest of the pedigree we can talk about. He's an IIT Madras graduate, IIM Ahmedabad, London Business School alumnus, consulting a background with the best of names, McKinsey, and then later on Egon Zehnder, where he did work in executive search. And finally, he's become an independent CEO coach. So that's as far as the pedigree is concerned, but there's lots more to introducing Deepak, which I've known as a friend, peek into his personal life. I know that he's very good at his job. I've met quite a few of his clients who rate him very highly. But more importantly, I know he's been a marathoner. He plays great cricket, played cricket with him. He plays the guitar and pretty good at that.
And he knows Hindi songs, Hindi movie songs really well.
Yes. Yeah. And one of the things that most people don't know is that he's learned juggling as well. He can juggle balls and whatnot. In fact, it's a metaphor for the book. If you see the cover of the book, got somebody juggling the hats there, which is essentially the crux of this book. How do you juggle different aspects of your life? And more importantly, what I remember Deepak most, we live in the same building, by the way. Besides bumping into each other in the gym and on the cricket field, I see him spend a lot of time with his kids, taking them for late night ice creams or watching test cricket at the Wankhede. So it is, I mean, he walks the talk. It's not just the book. I say, see him lead a full life, which is the subtitle of the book, Play to Potential, and become the best you. So it's a pleasure knowing you, Deepak, and it was transforming reading the book, and I would urge all our leaders, audience to grab a copy of the book. But just to tease you to doing that, we'll have hopefully an interesting conversation on that. So my introduction is my introduction. Deepak, start off. Why don't you tell us, why did you write this book? Clearly, you can't separate the author from the book. So why don't you take us through your journey that led you to write Play to Potential?
Got it. So first of all, thank you, Pramod, for the kind words, and thank you, Saurabh and Pramod, for hosting this and for the curiosity in the book. Grateful. I think if I had to rewind the clock, I would go back to 2016. Till 2016, I would say I was part of large organizations, KPMG Consulting in the UK and in India, McKinsey in the US. I came back to India in the context of a personal, if I may say, development. My father was diagnosed with cancer in 2008. Sort of, I understand you came back to India around the same time. I came back to India with a short-term transfer to McKinsey, but then Lehman happened. Going back to the US didn't make sense. So one of my mentors at that time said, you seem to have a passion for the people side of things. Have you thought of search? So that's when I moved to Egon Zehnder in Mumbai, helping companies find CEOs. But as I spent time there, I realized that at the end of the day, search is a talent broking business. There's no looking away from it. Sort of strip the bells and whistles. And I realized that I got my energy more from nurturing and helping people than from evaluating people. And one of my friends actually looked at me and said, you seem to have more of a coaching mindset than a poaching mindset. And there are two different mindsets. So 2016, I said somehow I wanted to spend more time helping people, less time evaluating people. I set out on my own. That's around the time I had my second child as well. I realized that if I belong to a platform, they set the pace of the treadmill. You know, you spoke about running. One thing I've learned as a half marathoner, not a marathoner, to be factually right, is that you need to get the pace right. You know, if you want to run a marathon, if you get the pace wrong, you'll be huffing and puffing very soon. And I realized that belonging to a platform, I couldn't run at the pace they were setting for me. So I said, my race, my pace. So I said, let me start my own practice, coaching practice. And that's when I said, I need to sow a seed which becomes something meaningful over time. And that started the Play to Potential podcast in 2016. But I said, let me go on a learning journey to curate insights around leadership, transitions, and careers. And as I sort of spoke to more people, I've spoken to 100 odd people so far, and hopefully I see this as a journey of life, journey of curiosity for life. at some point I felt I'd had enough conversations and there was an opportunity for me to distill those into something meaningful. And initially it started out as a project just to distill the wisdom from the podcast. But as I wrote, one of my friends, Vivek, came to our Begons and actually said, that, is it just a string of pearls or is there a Deepak recipe on top of it? As I thought about the flavor framework emerged, and I felt I had a distinctive point of view on playing the full potential. So in a way, that's sort of the long and short of how I got here. And the Play to Potential journey is 8 years old, but the book writing journey is about 2 years old, which is an attempt to build on some of the lessons and apply my perspective on what it is to build a beautiful life.
So, what's very interesting about this book is it speaks to all of us middle-aged professionals. It's almost, I hope you're not sort of underselling yourself, because the book itself is so useful.
Thank you.
After reading it, I felt maybe I won't have to call upon Deepak Jayaraman services. And the reason the book speaks to us, I think, is because you explicitly address the challenge. Very early on in the book, you address the challenge of what you call the midlife challenge, right? It's got other less polite terms used elsewhere, but the midlife challenge, as you call it, and we say that you make it sound as if it's a ubiquitous universal challenge. It hits all of us.
Yes.
I have to admit, one of the reasons we set up Transcends 6 years ago was we reached that midlife challenge in Transcends. Why does this happen? Why do we all hit this midlife challenge, and why is it so hard to surmount this midlife challenge?
A great question. I think a few reasons, right? One is I think all of us are hit by a triple whammy very often around midlife, right? One is work is often the most intense. That's sort of, in a way, if I were to use a metaphor of cricket, that's when the power play of a life sort of comes in. We have a few years of experience and we're sort of striding and we're sort of pushing. And then very often that's around the time when kids are growing up and they are demanding. That's often the time when parents are aging, that's demanding. So in a way, and there are limitations on our mobility, there's maternity, there's geographical constraints, etc. There are multiple factors hitting us from different directions. And I think on top of that, that's also the time where when we are young, let's say when you're 10 years old and somebody says, "Beta kya banoge?" You don't have enough data to work with to have a view. It's a theoretical question. But once a few years elapse, actually we have real data to work with because we know we have some experiences, some we enjoy, we know what we're getting good at. But strangely enough, that's also the time where the mind space to process some of this data is the lowest, given the number of things that we're dealing with. So that's why I feel.
Just to be clear, you're talking about late 30s or early 40s, what's the age?
Good question. So I think even what is midlife, I think is evolving, right? Earlier, I would have said that maybe 10, 20 years back, one would have said maybe 40, 50 is middle age. If we assume we start working around early 20s and we were working till 60, then 40 is actually around the sort of the middle of the working period.
Yes.
So 40 plus or minus could be called middle age. But I think two things are happening. I think people are experiencing this angst much earlier because of what I call paradox of choice. Earlier, 20 years back, there were straight lines, right? Doctor, commerce, engineering, and straight line. Now, right from 12th, there are millions of courses to choose from. Which board do I send a kid to? Or even career paths.
Which country do I stay in?
Which country do I stay in? So I think Barry Schwartz has written a wonderful book called Paradox of Choice, where he says that when you offer more choice to consumers, you'd like to believe that they get happier. But actually they are worse off because A, decision making has gotten complex, and B, there's FOMO. If there are 100 pathways and you take one, there are 99 reasons for you to be unhappy, saying, "Yeah, gosh." So to your point, what started out as 40 plus or minus now, I think is a sort of beginning to hit people around 25, 30 on the sort of the left end. On the right end, I think we're all living longer, given advances in healthcare. So 60 as a retirement age, I think, is becoming a question mark because at 60, many people are finding themselves, I have the mojo, I have the energy, I can work for another 10 years. We're going to, I think economically speaking, there's enough research to say if you're all going to live 100 years, let's say plus or minus, then we need to be working into our 70s for us to fund that life. So in a way now that window is getting long.
So you're saying it's hitting the paradox of choice.
Yes.
These are the proliferation of choices. And by as early as 30, somebody could be hitting this midlife challenge.
I think so. People are now talking about quarter life crisis, right? So I think what used to bother people at 40 now is beginning to bother people at 25 and 30, just given the explosion of the number of choices they need to make.
And what does your book say? What should one do when you are hit with the midlife challenge?
I think the chapter after midlife actually is on self-awareness, right? So I feel going back to the metaphor of careers, earlier it was like a motorway where you had to focus on having a good engine to run the race fast. Now I think careers are looking more and more like a maze, where I think the steering wheel has become more important than the engine. And to me, that steering wheel is self-awareness. And what do I mean by self-awareness? I think there's an element of reflecting deeper on what we're good at, what we enjoy, the family context, etc., etc. But I think there's also an element of seeking feedback from the world around us. I find that very often some industries, especially the financial services industry, I find is a sort of often a low feedback industry because people look at your returns and outcomes, but very often the behavioral feedback piece, whether when I look at venture capital, private equity, or banking, etc., the feedback loop around what are you distinctive at, where do you get joy, etc., is missing. So I think your point, starting point, I say, is try and build your self-awareness and try and marry it with a healthy level of reflection and outside in. And when I say outside in, the chapter I provocatively call it how 360 is your 360, because your current colleagues at work only represent a small sliver of the world that interacts with you. If you really want to get to know yourself, I tell people, if you want to know me, spend half an hour with my wife. She will tell you 80% of whatever you need to know. So I find that very often, if we sort of are a little more open about where we get data about ourselves, when are we at our best, what gives us joy, what are our blind spots, and include, for example, when I'm working with somebody in a coaching context, I would speak to the spouse, sibling, if they're comfortable, parents, friends, ecosystem, colleague, current colleagues, past colleagues, then that you get a sense of who you are as a person, what makes you distinctive. Then based on that, you start making choices. That gives you the steering wheel to navigate the maze. Then you sort of pick a canvas, because the other type, the reason, I like the phrase play to potential is one of my guests actually said, one of the questions I ask when I wrap a podcast is, what does the phrase play to potential mean to you? And one of my guests said, the answer is in your title. You can't work to potential, you can only play to potential. So we all need to figure out what is play for us. When does it feel like we are playing? And when we are playing, we can, that's a more sustainable way of living life. It's less depletive. It feels like work. Then we get into the discussions around 70 hours and 60 hours.
Flow, we're in flow then.
Exactly.
Flow. Creative juices are flowing.
Exactly. Play and flow are quite highly correlated.
They're immersed in.
Exactly. So I think, and then of course there's flavor, and we'll get into some of that. But I think self-awareness is the one thing I would say very often, especially given paradox of choice. I feel if we don't have the steering wheel, we could lose our way very quickly.
In terms of framework, one of the frameworks that seems to be appealing to a lot of people has been ikigai. Whenever you're lost, ikigai has become popular for a reason. But in your book, you've dedicated an entire chapter to highlight the limitations of ikigai. So what's wrong with ikigai and how are you different?
Yeah, true. I think I should clarify where I stand, right? I say this in the book, a North Star can't do the job of a torchlight. I think they are different things meant for different purposes. And my disconnect is very often ikigai urges us to look for that sweet spot, right? What you enjoy, what you're good at, what the world needs and what the world will pay you for. But very often I find that, and to use a Hindi phrase, right, majburi hai. Sometimes you need to do things because life is not ideal. I need to work in a job that I don't enjoy because I need to put food on the table. I don't have the luxury, or maybe I'm out of campus. I don't have the luxury to operate at that sweet spot. So I think for a lot of people, when I sort of met people in my coaching work and otherwise, I found that ikigai felt like Mount Everest for a lot of people. Most people want to do a trek.
Too much to ask.
Too much to ask. Wishful thinking. And yes, it's an ideal to aspire to. And the other piece, which I was uncomfortable with, was ikigai had a little bit of a, here's where I will drill for oil kind of a feeling. I've come to ikigai, so I've arrived, so I keep drilling. But I find that life is full of transitions and it's never static. The wheel of life keeps spinning. And somehow I felt it didn't quite account for the dynamism of life and the number of moving parts. Like, for example, I came to India because of my father's cancer situation. 3 months earlier, I was in the US in a very different context. Nothing could have, so I think somewhere I feel, I felt it spoke to you at a point in time, but when I look at life as a movie rather than a photo, I felt it didn't quite account for the transitions and the messiness. So two things. One is sort of the worm's eye view versus the bird's eye view. And the other was a little bit of a time view versus a static view, which I felt it was sort of,
it has a place. I think it's good to march in that. I mean, I talk about a quote from the movie Lincoln, where somebody asked Lincoln, what about your principle? What about your true north? When he decides to do something that's seemingly, counterintuitive. And he says, a compass will point you to the true north, but it has no guidance for the swamps or the ravines or the ditches you'll encounter along the way. So in the pursuit of the true north, if you sink in a swamp, there's no glory in it. So to me, true north is a bit like that. It's a compass. You can march, but if you don't navigate the well in front of you or the swamp in front of you, then there's no glory in it. So I think that's the way I see it.
Can you give us this navigation tool, which I think is FLAVOUR, from what I can make out in the book? FLAVOUR
Yes,
is the acronym. So if you could just help our
of course
viewers understand what is FLAVOUR.
Of course. So the first piece, F, maybe if you're okay, I'll project a page. So the starting point is family. I feel a lot of the literature, going back to ikigai, is often written suggesting life is a solo sport. But I feel life is a team sport, and a team being family. Now, what is family varies from person to person, but in most situations, in nuclear families, is typically spouse, kids. In some cases, it's parents, some cases, siblings. But I find that, when I look around, a lot of choices we make are in the context of the family situation and the transitions. And when I say family, there are 3-4 pieces. One is the money context. If you're Jeff Bezos's child, then you don't need to worry about what the world will pay you for. Then you're solving something else. So I find that all of us are in different financial contexts, and this might be relevant in the context of some of your clients, right? So if I come from a place of abundance, maybe I'm seeking purpose, then solving for money is less important.
Yeah.
But if I'm coming from a place of, let's say, scarcity, then that becomes important. So I think family, one is about the family context in terms of what's the P&L for the family and the balance sheet of the family, number one. Number two, I think there are also a lot of transitions that are happening in the family, right? There's maternity, there's empty nesting, there is retirement, there's a loss of a loved one. For example, my father's loss brought me back to India. So I think tuning, that's why I say family, to use a musical metaphor, family to me is like the bass note on which we play the melody of life, right? So you can't be jarring with the bass note. So I think there's an element of tuning into the family context. That's, I feel, is important. Second piece I feel is we all need to find some space for what we truly love. Now, ikigai, once again, gets you to think about working on things that you love. But I find that when I talk to people, most people do something to earn a living, but find love somewhere else, right? In my case, it's guitar. For some people, it's playing cricket. For some people, it's gardening. For some people, it's cooking. But something that engages the heart and something that sort of re-energizes us, right? So that's the second part. Of course, if you find it in what you work, then that's gold. But then less than 1% go there, I feel. So that's L. A is aspiration, and that's where the juggling hats come in, back to the cover. I find that very often we discuss ambition. And to me, ambition feels unidimensional. I want to sort of build a unicorn. I want to make X million dollars, or I want to be a partner. I want to be an MD. It's yes, one vector. But I find that if I look at identities, we all carry multiple identities. I'm a son, I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm a coach, I'm a podcaster, I'm an author, I'm a guitarist, etc. Now, if we want to play the long game, how do we cultivate each one of these identities? And what I suggest is, let's have an aspiration which is multidimensional across these identities.
Right.
And in the book, I talk about an approach where we can set short-term goals for each of these identities and move forward. It's not, I mean, the simple example I give is, if you have an exam, I used to write CBSE exams. If you've got 5 questions, 5 papers, 500 marks, 100 in math and failing in English is not a good report card, right? So I think what I suggest to people is, how do we have a healthy report card, not just excellence in one subject, which is often focusing on ambition. That's A. VO is about figuring out how do we be of value and seek the opportunity. I think the world of work is changing. And when we start off, work comes in nicely shaped boxes, right? You're an associate here, you're a management trainee here, you're a AVP here, blah, blah, blah. But I think once you get into 30s and 40s, I find that that gets very nebulous.
Yeah.
All of us have to take stock of what's the capital we have in terms of skills, networks, passion, etc. And I say we all need to go on the talent market dating process. And the world is not going to design a job for you. You need to discover what's unique and figure out, how do you date your way into the opportunity?
Right.
And it's not cooked. Sometimes you need to cook it yourself, and that's a process.
Yeah.
And paradoxically enough, I find that people that land the first job well, it's like almost like marrying the first person you meet. Subsequently, they struggled with the dating process because they haven't built that muscle. They haven't experienced rejection. They haven't experienced circulation. Right? If you know what I mean. So that's VO. U is investing in yourself, which is in a way the intangible balance sheet, right? Physical health, mental health, and capabilities to keep us relevant.
Right.
And R is relationships, which is, of course, friends, which sort of bring joy and keep us going. But also relationships I see as a pathway to opportunity. Very often, the people we meet open doors for us. And sort of in a way, relationships is not just about feeling good and happy and man is a social animal kind of a thing. But I think relationships, I feel, are a key element of creating the future because they open doors.
Open
pathways, new worlds. I mean, I call it the 9 3/4 platform, right? Suddenly Hogwarts is suddenly it opens up. For me, that opened up when a mentor of mine, Ramesh Mangaleshwar, introduced me to Egon Zehnder. Otherwise, post McKinsey, the world of, let's say, human capital wouldn't have opened up for me. That he opened that platform, and then subsequently things have happened.
I owe my first job in India to Egon as well.
Oh, is it?
So
lovely.
We share that, and my coach was introduced to me by Egon as well. So
fascinating. Who's Namrata? Is it?
So Namrata introduced me to Anna, and that's how the book came about.
Namrata was a neighbor. She's a dear mentor, and
I think she's fabulous at what she does. But I think in FLAVOUR, you've given those who are watching perhaps the most useful acronym they've come across. This is the most useful acronym I've come across to solve this midlife piece. I wish I had met you 10 years ago.
No, thank you for the kind words. I think the last point, if I may make, Saurabh, is I find that life is not static, right? So I find that just like Satya Nadella talks about hit refresh in his book, all of us need to hit refresh with FLAVOUR as we go through life. I mean,
so on that, right? You've used this Christopher Nolan fabulous movie Dunkirk.
Yes.
You've used that as a metaphor. I'm a big Chris Nolan fan. I watched Dunkirk in 3D IMAX.
Wow.
I was very happy that day. Can you help us understand that metaphor? This hit, refresh, and timing and pause, and how time works in various dimensions. You could help us understand that. As
the time in the pause beat, just relevance. Today we have the first world championship starting.
Yes.
You used Vishy Anand's pause after the 40th move.
Correct.
So can you give, in what context do you bring the 40th move?
It's actually interrelated. So thanks for teeing that up. So I'm a big fan of Nolan, also because I like the fact that he has, probably does a movie every 5 years or whatever, but produces a masterpiece, right? So I somehow, when I look at artists like him, I say, okay, the artisan wakes up to say, okay, sort of the frequency doesn't matter, but the quality should matter. So in a way, I've had 100 podcast conversations over 8 years. Now, for a lot of people, that would feel like really slow output, but I'm okay with that. Again, not that I'm saying I'm Nolan, but I'm saying people like him give me hope that quality will hopefully will win the day.
I'm sure it will.
Dunkirk, I think what appealed to me for the purpose of people who haven't seen the movies, I think it shows the movie in 3 different time scales, right? One is sort of a time scale of an hour, which is, I think, the airplane. The other is a time scale of a day, which is, I think, the ocean, and then the time scale of a week, which is the ground, I think, or I'm mixing it up. But it's basically 1 hour, 1 day, and 1 week. And I find it helpful in the context of how we think about building a pause in our life. And I'll get to the move 40 in a minute. But I find that a big piece, I think somebody is saying Saurabh from all speak louder. My voice is okay.
Carry on.
Should I move?
No, you're the speaker. You're the starter. You carry on.
We'll jump.
So then I think the microphone hopefully.
Carry on. So you're Dunkirk.
So I think even as we think about reflecting, I've found that different pauses have different benefits. For example, I find that pausing at the end of every hour, for example, the leaders I work with, especially during COVID, what we used to do was, if you have an hour meeting, make it 45 minutes or 50 minutes and take the 10 minutes to decompress. Because very often when you sort of do it as a back to back, there is psychological spillover.
Yes.
You might have had a fight with X and that translates to Y.
Absolutely, it does.
And it sort of sets off a domino, right? A chain reaction. So I think that sort of pause in a sort of hourly context. Then I suggest a pause in a daily context, which is really, some people do it first thing in the morning, after a run, when you've sort of run the washing machine in your head. Very often when you go for exercise, your mind often is sort of working, right?
Yeah.
It's sort of not
Churning.
proactively churning, right?
Yeah.
And some of the best ideas actually come when you're not actively thinking about something. So I suggest some sort of a daily pause to sort of sediment what your mind is telling you. And the third is not weekly, but I suggest a monthly pause or a quarterly. I think I suggest 3 or 4 pauses. But the limited point I want to make, Saurabh, is every time scale, pausing across every time scale has a different set of benefits. Let's say an hourly time scale pause might help you with equanimity and centering yourself and not sort of derailing. A yearly pause might throw the light on values. For example, before writing the book, I took a week off in the hills just to sort of gather my thoughts and be in nature. My daughter was doing a camp in Himachal, so I sort of used that as an opportunity to take the break. But I think it gave me clarity around the why, my why, what do I stand for, etc. Now that may not happen on a daily basis. The limited point I want to make is as we go through life, are we building a pause across these different time scales so that we can sort of benefit from the clarity it provides us, whether it's equanimity, whether it's clarity around the what, or the clarity around the why, which might emerge across different time scales. Now, coming to move number 40, I think I had Vishy Anand as one of my guests at the podcast.
Wow.
And he actually brought up this interesting point about move number 40 in games, where let's say you're playing I might get the facts slightly off, but let's say you're playing a 2-hour game. At the end of move 40, apparently 30 minutes get added to each player's clock.
Right.
And what he says is very often, if it's a competitive game, you might be at 1 minute 58 seconds in the 39th move. So you've got, 1 hour 58 minutes. You're sort of 2 minutes short and you're playing the 39th move. You're really under time pressure. But once you cross 40, suddenly there's a block of 30 minutes that have been added to you. Now, if you don't account for what Vishy went on to say was most people don't realize that this new block has been added and they end up making something silly, a silly mistake in the 41st or the 42nd move because they're still sort of operating in that clock, which is under time scarcity. So he said, I've now learned to take a break, take a walk, have a coffee, come back, and then almost started like a new game afresh with a fresh pair of eyes. So I think it's sort of linking it back to what you asked, Saurabh. I think it's a useful metaphor for building that pause, because very often I think we operate under a false sense of urgency, while it may not be as urgent as we deem it is. So just building a pause, I think, helps us be a little more.
Given Gukesh got trained by Vishy Anand, hopefully he'll keep that in mind and pause at the end of the 40th move.
Indeed.
But a lot of it, what you shared is dependent on self-awareness, and you rightly pointed it out.
Yes.
And one of the striking pieces you bring out in this book is Robert Kegan's study about how few people, how little a percentage of the population is actually self-aware. Could you bring that out, the stages of adult development?
Yes. Bob Kegan is somebody who studied how we transition, right, from child to adult. And if I may project a screen.
One of the reasons I like the book was it's not just theoretical gyan. The second half of the book is real people, their stories, and how the flavor framework applies to a whole bunch of real life leaders. I found that part of the book very useful.
Thank you.
You build the theoretical framework and then you're applying it to, I think, is it a dozen or so?
6 people.
Six leaders, half a dozen leaders. And I thought that application of the flavor framework to real leaders, real lives were very useful.
Thank you. Thank you. And just maybe 30 seconds on that, Saurabh. What I've also tried to do in the book is to have audio inserts, audio snippets from the podcast, and even videos of these interviews with these leaders. If people want to go deeper, there are QR codes along the book.
Fantastic.
So they can listen to the 1-hour conversation just to absorb the nuances of their journey. But back to Bob Kegan, Pramod, what he says is initial years, first 6 years, you're a child and your mind is evolving. Then you move to teenage. And that is sort of stage 2. Teenage is stage 2. He calls it the impulsive mind as a child. Imperial mind is the teenager that sort of is self-obsessed and thinks the world. As a parent of a teenager, I see you nodding vigorously. And then gets into interesting territory, right? Then he calls it the next element to be the socialized mind, where we are driven by what the world expects of us, right? He says that's the socialized mind, where a lot of our choices is based on how will I look, what will the world think, what am I ought to do, etc. And the next stage, he says, stage 4, he calls it the self-authoring mind, which is people are living an inside-out life, saying, yeah, this is who I am. forget what the world thinks. This is what I believe in. And the last, he says 1% is the self-transforming mind, which is 1% of the population, which he says are people like Buddha, Gandhiji, Mother Teresa. But I think to me, the two numbers that are interesting are 35% of the people. It's only 35%. Let's say 1/3 of the population is in the self-authoring mind, which is sort of leading an authentic life, saying, this is what I am, this is who I am, this is what matters to me, and doing what they want to do. A large chunk, 58%, 60% is still leading a life of optics, if I may use that, saying this is what the world, this is what I should be doing to appear good or appear successful. And to me, that's an opportunity. You know, if more and more of the 60% or 58% can move to this side, then hopefully we'll have more people who are content, happy.
Right. That's where the target addressable market for.
Exactly. That's a good way of putting it.
But is that an increasing challenge with social media now? I'm sure Bob Keegan might have written this.
Good point.
Pre-social media world, if at all, I see more and more kids living their life for external validation now.
Very true. Again, this data is probably a little dated, but I mean, this was more to provide a little bit of a directional view. I think social media presents a couple of challenges, Pramod. One is, I think it increases exposure to what others are doing, and you are exposed to the best 1% of other people's lives, right? People's messiness is not visible.
Yeah.
So in a way, it accentuates that socialized mind, drives that FOMO. Social media also comes in the way of us getting in touch with ourselves in the self-awareness, because people, I find the limited time or buffer time that when I would take a bus, I would gaze out of the window.
Now you stay at your phone.
Yeah. That gazing out of the window, what we don't realize is actually it's sort of
therapy.
Therapy, right? Mindfulness, and so it's a double whammy. So my guess is this number is probably, I haven't done the research for this, but my instinct is the 58% is now hovering around the 60s or 70s.
I think it's even more powerful. Social media is even more powerful, and perhaps negatively so, in a society like ours with wide disparities.
That's true.
Because here the top 1%'s lives are even far away
pronounced
from the average Joe. And they thus lose I think for a lot of people, they thus lose all sense of reality.
True.
Watching the top 1%'s live on social media.
Very true.
Even we're an investment firm, and our most far guru is Warren Buffett.
Yes.
He talks about the inner scorecard, right? So the inner scorecard is perhaps self-authoring plus self-transforming stage. What he doesn't say is within that, what he actually, I mean, where does inner scorecard lie? Is it enough to get into self-authoring stage? How many investors actually get into self-transforming?
It's true. Again, my only limited point is, as long as we've crossed the bridge of external validation, internal validation, that itself, I think, is a good place to be. Right? I think good to great, I think we will see later, but let's at least get to a good place, right? I feel the real opportunity is to really go in and lead a life that's valuable to you, meaningful to you, right? For example, if I may take the liberty, he was telling me that you take public transport and you do what you feel like doing, not because the world expects you to live life in a certain way. To me, that's an example
it's also the case that I'm saving up for my children's education.
Of course. But I'm saying, the point is, we all need to find those answers true to who we are.
Yeah.
I met an investor, I met a country head of an investment bank over the weekend, and he said, the world around me drives a BMW, but I drive a Honda City, but I'm okay with it because, this is who I am. These are my needs, and that's how I want to.
In fact, if you aspirate, one of the defining traits I've seen of successful business leaders the world over, not just abroad, but even in India. One of the defining traits of successful business leaders is this utter disdain for what everybody else is doing. Whether it be Aditya Puri not carrying a mobile phone, Velayan Subaiya doesn't carry a mobile phone, Uday Kotak still has a modest car, right? And initially, when I came across this behavior in my early 30s, I couldn't quite rationalize it. And then it took me till my mid 40s to understand what was at play here. And then I found that trait of not having regard for what is the accepted way of living or expressing wealth and power links to originality of thought.
Of course.
Links to being able to make business decisions which are which are perhaps seen unconventional at the time, but later on turn out to be prescient.
Very true.
And it's a linked set of behaviors. In my early 30s, I couldn't rationalize it. It took me till my mid 40s to figure out what was at play here. And once I understood it, we linked it to Warren Buffett's scorecard.
Yes.
Linked it to Warren Buffett's scorecard. Then it made a lot of sense that if you are to think originally,
yes,
and live the life that you want, you in effect have to detach to some extent.
Yes.
From other people's wants and desires. Social media makes it very hard.
Yes.
Social media keeps coming at you saying, this is the way the world lives.
Sort of in your face, right?
This is what the world expects of you. And in fact, it was very interesting. Yesterday, Virat Kohli scored his first century in 18 months.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So this being Australia, as soon as he scored the century, Adam Gilchrist interviewed him. And even the great Virat Kohli referenced that, what other people were saying about me was getting to me, right? He referenced it.
Sure.
And, it's stunning, right? A man who averages 48 in Test cricket, 50 plus, mid-50s, I think, in one-day cricket, one of the great Indian champs of his era, referencing some troller on social media who's got no idea at what level Virat Kohli is operating. But you can see that even at that level of elite success, social media can get to you. And therefore, I think it's a very powerful and perhaps very negative thing that I think all of us need to be aware of. But just staying on that theme of Warren Buffett, right? One of the other things you do as you reference some of these other leaders is you highlight that in many of their cases, they have figured out that this is where I stand in the world. This is what I want to do. I think there's a leader called Vineet,
yes,
who you reference, and I think you give a quote.
Vineet Panchi.
And he give a quote where he says, he quotes some other great leader. He says,
Yes.
this is where it took me a while to figure out, this is where I stand in the world.
Yes.
And once I understood that, everything else fell in place. Can you just take us to this framework? How does that one get to that level of self-actualization?
Very true. As I said, Vineet Panchi is one of the 6 people I've profiled, and maybe just to give a sense, he grows up in Dehradun, starts with a degree in hotel management, then tries a bunch of things, including HR, radio jingles, etc., then comes back to Dehradun. And today, and along the way, he discovers a gentleman called Matt Langdon, who's a professor in the US. And there's a quote from Matt Langdon which says, the opposite of a hero is not a villain, it's a bystander. Right? And he says, that quote hit me, saying, and he's a storyteller at heart. I mean, he writes poems and he's got a very ardent fan following for some of his nazms and all that. So he says, why don't I make this my mission? And he now runs something called the Jai Hind Project, which among many things leads a portfolio life. One of the things is Jai Hind Project, where he says, we need to bring to life some of these real life heroes who are making a change, who are not being bystanders, rather than real life heroes, right? People who are celebrated, who get the time. So I think, and to answer your question about how did he get here, I think it's once again how people work with the self-awareness. I think varies from case to case. Like I have one of the other people I profiled, Soma Biswas, is a painter. So she says, when I paint, it's like therapy and it sort of gives clarity to me. In the case of Vineet, it's travel. Around COVID, he said, I just took my Jeep and I sort of went out on a Bharat Darshan. I just didn't have a destination. I just stopped at different places, lived in different people's homes. And that gave me clarity. It also taught me, told me about my place in the world. Some of us may not have that flexibility or luxury. We might have to find avenues within our sort of scheme of things to drive self-awareness. But I think the key question and the key piece I keep coming back to, Saurabh, is just really we need to find what works for us to discover ourselves. And that's a journey.
Yeah.
It's not a straight line. It's sort of, you just need to give enough time. Sumit Mehta, for example, another person I'm profiled here, he runs a unicorn company called Lead, which is invested by Westbridge Capital, which has also funded Gukesh, Westbridge Anand Chennis Academy.
Yes.
So he was a Procter & Gamble for a few years, but at some point he said, I'm not sure if this is where my heart is. So he takes a sabbatical, quits, comes back, and his father was a teacher in Pathankot in Punjab. He just says, 6 months, I just went with him, I taught, just figured out a bunch of things, tried a bunch of things. And then he said, my mission is to solve the education problem for millions of kids in India, provide quality education, and let me not solve it through the Byju's model, which again, all of us know where it stands today. But let me solve it. Let me not try and build something in addition to the school. Let me make the school great. So he's got a tech-enabled operating system that that schools can use around tier 2, tier 3 towns to deliver quality education. So I think now for him, that sabbatical, the pause was a sabbatical. For some people, it's travel. For some people, it's painting. So we all need to find what is our pause that will give us clarity, that will hopefully put us on that path.
Very interesting. There's a question from one of our listeners. So Akash is asking, how is play to potential different from other self-help or business category books?
I think when I looked around, as I said, one is I found that a lot of the books spoke about life as a solo sport. So I've tried to bring the family in, which I feel is a key part of the puzzle. Sort of solving some of these elements around passion, purpose, etc. Without the family element, I feel is a big piece missing. So at least I frame this whole playing to potential as a team sport, team being family. Second, I feel a long life is often a series of innings punctuated by transitions. So I've tried to provide some perspective on not just how to play the innings, but also how to manage the transition. I find if you don't manage the transition well, then you might have played a great innings. It's a bit like clay court to grass court. You know, when people move, they need to adapt. They need to go through a process of adapting in terms of how you move your feet, how the ball bounces, etc. So I think how to deal with transitions, I think, is a key part of the puzzle as well as we look at the movie of life. And the last I would say is, since I've done these podcasts and I've had these video interviews, there's an opportunity for people to go deeper into some of these insights. If they want to double click, then there is sort of, I see it more as a play to potential experience rather than a play to potential book. People have an opportunity to sort of go deeper, immerse themselves. So I'd say those are the 2-3 pieces. And last point I might make is hopefully that, for a long time, I thought language was what we use to describe a situation, but I've come to realize that language can also generate new possibilities. Hopefully the flavor and the rediscover flavor gives people language to sort of design a balanced scorecard for themselves and play a long game with joy and vitality.
So the concept of the balanced scorecard, I mean, sort of brought it out, right? So he's not driven by external validation. He's happy to go in a Kali Pili taxi. But yet, he also said that he's saving up for his kids' education, which is financial resources and money. Sort of drive a lot of our choices. And hence, while I want to tick all the boxes in the flavor framework, I'm constrained. And in the book, you bring out this aspect. Effectively, I need more time to tick a lot of the other boxes. And you can drill this conundrum down to the money versus time trade-off. And you bring this Taylor versus Morgan framework to address it. You just talk a little more about that.
Sure. And before I go there, just wanted to sort of maybe add to one of the things you said. What I'm not saying is we need to tick all the boxes of flavor, right? I feel flavor is a bit like a business model. It needs to be coherent. And all I say is we need to be deliberate about some of the trade-offs we make. By design, there is tension, right? If you want to invest in yourself, there is finite time because you've got kids, you've got work, you've got other things. You don't have time for a hobby. So there is clearly tension in the wheel, which is pulling you in different directions. But working on our self-awareness and working with flavor at least gets us to be deliberate about these trade-offs, just like how we are deliberate about a business model. If you're running a low-cost airline, you're deliberate about not offering a business class seat. So that's sort of point number one. It's not about ticking the boxes, but about making a set of deliberate, consistent choices and trade-offs. Now, back to the Taylor Morgan, I think that comes from a lady called Ashley Willens. She's a prof at Harvard Business School. I had a chance to talk to her, and she's written a book called Time Smart. And the crux of her book is that very often we measure money. It's easy to measure, right? Wealth. But she says that people who have a lot of money but are time poor actually experience a certain sense of poverty. She says that actually they have a lot of money, but since they are so full, their calendar is sort of 120% crammed, that there's a certain sense of feeling of, if I may say, unhappiness or a certain sense of pain that they experience, which often, and she's tried to put a number to it, etc. I mean, there's a quote, right? Money doesn't buy happiness, but it does buy a pleasant form of misery. So she sort of expands on that, and she talks about, she divides the world into two types, right? She says there are the Taylors and there are the Morgans. I mean, to keep it open to both genders, I would say there are the Teresas and there are the Michelles. You know, the T's and the M's. The T's are those people that place a premium on how they spend time. If I may say, if I may broadly call it experiences. And therefore they sort of do things that bring them joy, that they enjoy, and you know, they sort of maximize the experience of life. M's are the people that are a little more product driven, saying I want to, you know, I want to increase my asset size, I want to increase the pot of money and the products. What she says is, paradoxically enough, people that are prioritizing time end up making more money than people that are prioritizing money, because she says these people end up focusing on what gives them joy, end up working much harder, striving much harder, and end up going up that curve of competence, because they are sort of climbing a tree, which is fun, climbing a mountain, which is fun to climb. Therefore, they end up going to greater heights, which is the interesting paradox for me. So by solving for T, actually you're solving for more M, which is a little more of an indirect way of getting to more M.
So I think that brings us nicely to this question that Uday Shah has asked. What exactly do you mean by self-awareness in the context of professional life?
See, I think very often in professional life, I find that self-awareness is treated in one plane, strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But I've come to realize that there are many other dimensions to it. You know, for example, what are your superpowers is one thing I work with my coaches. And just like a venture capitalist has some firms that are doing well, some portfolio companies that really hit the ball out of the park, and some which are duds. I find that the distinctive or disproportionate returns come from superpowers, not from plugging weaknesses, right? So very often people, and paradoxically enough, it turns out that we are very poor judges of our own superpowers. We sometimes need people around us to point it out. For example, I needed a mentor from the outside to tell me you have a people orientation, you should do search. There's no way I would have meditated myself to that answer, right?
Yeah.
So number one, I ask people to open up the aperture of language. Don't just treat it as strengths and weaknesses, but treat it along the lines of what brings you joy, when are you in play and not at work, what are your superpowers, what are your, if I may say, triggers. You know, the other thing, for example, when I work with leaders, what happens is they are great 98% of the time, but there are triggers.
They lose it.
And as your blast radius increases, as you grow in seniority, that 1% wipes out all the goodwill that the 99% creates.
Yeah.
Right. So what are your triggers? So in the context of the workplace, I would say, I would urge people to A, open up the aperture of language in terms of how you look at yourself, and B, marry it with a healthy level of internal and external, right? And I find, I mean, the other insight, I got this from a lady called Tasha Eurich, who studied self-awareness, and she's written a book called Insight. I think her conversation is one of the 10 I refer at the end of the book, I think. She says that very often internal and external self-awareness can be orthogonal. You know, we learn different things through each of these. You know, what you learn from the other, you know, the best people, she actually calls a bunch of people self-awareness unicorns. For her book, she studies people who start at a lower point and finish at a higher level of self-awareness, to say these people are able to marry healthy mindfulness practices across the Dunkirk 3-time scales and external outside and input. And then they're able to lead a life of richness, right? So
this is one question which is relevant, and we were discussing this before. Mr. P.S. Rao says, can you throw some light on using flavor post-retirement? I know we were discussing this is equally applicable to homemakers, for example.
Yes.
So can you help throw light on Mr. P.S. Rao's question?
And absolutely. I think the post-retirement, I would say very often the key variable that comes into play is VO. I go back to the talent market dating process, because very often I find till that time people have been employed as a role in some company and they retire. Then the question is, how do you really figure out, how do you be of value to the world outside? Of course, very often it's accompanied by a certain transition in terms of maybe empty nesting. Those people often also have more time. So one is sort of take a look at your FLAVOUR, but the real variable that they often grapple with is VO. How do I be of value to the world? Because so till now I had a card. which determined how I added value. I was a MD here, or I was a partner here, or whatever. But now it's a blank canvas. And that's a dating process people have to go through, right? And what I tell people, and this is informed by the work of Herminia Ibarra of London Business School, is she says you can't think your way into a new way of acting. You need to act your way into a new way of thinking, right? So do a few experiments. Maybe some people who have a certain philanthropic bent. For example, I do some work with an organization called Social Venture Partners. Now, maybe engage with them. If you think you want to contribute, explore. If you want to be a mentor, maybe explore. If you want to be an advisor, if you want to teach. So I think there are different pathways. So I think the meta question often to answer is, what is the architecture I want? Do I want one big thing, or do I want a portfolio of things? And if it's a portfolio, then back to self-awareness, what are the kinds of experiments I can craft to eventually figure out what the VO could be? And of course, VO could change over time. But I think that's the one piece I would sort of shine the light on for people to solve, especially around retirement.
There's a question from Jagdish, and he's saying that, look, reading a self-help book is one part of the process. It's all very well, you've written the book, and a good book, it's a very lucid book to read. But Jagdish is saying implementing the contents of the book is the most difficult part, with this transient, in inverted commas, life-changing feeling fading away with time. So he's asking, should we approach self-help books differently? And what, in your opinion, will make, what is the best way to make permanent, everlasting change?
Wow. Permanent, everlasting change is a high bar.
After reading the book.
Keep reading the book.
No, I think very often it's a lonely journey, right? We all are in our individual journeys trying to figure the answer out, right? And it's not, there's no one right answer, life keeps evolving. But I think somewhere I find, and this sort of in the context of what I do otherwise as a coach, sometimes having somebody who can be a sparring partner with you can help, and somebody who can hold you accountable can help. Because very often, one of the people I spoke to was a gentleman called Bruce Feiler, and he uses the term story editing. And he says that very often when two kids, let's say two siblings, narrate a story about what happened in school, one person will start narrating and the other person quickly cuts in saying, no, that's not what happened. You bullied him or whatever, right? And what I've noticed is when you work with somebody else, it helps to have a sparring partner who sees the data with a different set of lenses and sort of problem solves it with you. So sometimes I find, let me give you an example, right? One of the leaders I worked with who was in transition at the time of retirement, he was the MD of a auto ancillary company. And he was saying, I'm thinking of teaching and doing a bunch of different things. But when I spoke to some of the people he had worked with and his family members, what emerged was actually he was distinctive at turnarounds. Okay. He comes from the manufacturing background.
Yeah.
And he'd shut down a factory in Thailand, something in Aurangabad and so on. And we said, maybe the skill set is relevant for distressed asset situations, where they're exactly looking for people who can take tough calls, turn around a situation. And then we explored that. Now, it was helpful that I spoke to a few people, showed the mirror, and that emerged as out of the problem-solving conversation. So the limited point I want to make is sometimes having somebody else look at the same problem with a different, fresh pair of eyes, who also sees the world of opportunity slightly differently, can sort of help you sort of, make better meaning out of the data around you, but also make better choices in terms of the pathways and the experiments and moving forward.
So what you're saying is the permanence or lack thereof from reading this book is not because of any lack of effort on Jagdish's part or say my part. It's because our interpretation of how this book can be applied to our lives might be a little off center to what might be actually the real interpretation of the book for our lives.
Very true. And I think there's a term for it. A lady called Amy Edmondson of Harvard calls it naive realism.
Right.
And she says that there is reality, but there is your view of reality.
Because it's distorted.
Your view of reality is one view of reality. But if you can marry it like a prism with multiple views, then you get closer to the objective truth.
Folks, I've lived through distorted reality. So if you want to read my version of my distorted view of myself, read Unfiltered. You'll find plenty of distortions about my self-perception.
So, like the sparring partner, Vivek Pai asks, are there other habits that you can cultivate which makes flavor internal to you? I know you talk about journaling in your book.
Yes.
Can you give some practical habits that people can consciously build, which in
I
turn
think,
build flavor?
I would say 2, 3 things, right, Pramod? One is, I think, this whole pausing, journaling. I find, there's a gentleman called Rich Fernandez who I've spoken to at the podcast. He runs this thing called Search Inside Yourself, which was a company which was a part of Google. And Google said, we help people search the world, but can we help people search inside themselves? And they looked at monks, they look at neuroscience, etc., and they put together a program. And at some point they said this actually can be spun out as a separate unit. Now, Search Inside Yourself works with organizations around the world to drive mindfulness. And he actually says journaling is a bit like running a version update on yourself, just like we run a version update on our computers or our mobile phones. He says every time you journal, you're actually moving that 1 inch forward in terms of creating a new reality, because each journal moves you in that direction. So I think journaling I find helpful. Second, I feel is again pausing, traveling, painting, art. And I think that's why the L in the flavor, what I've not spoken enough about is I find that especially in the corporate world, a lot of people operate with their heads, but the heart element is missing. So I think having something that gives you joy, whether it's art or theater or music or painting, where there's no ROI for the time, you're doing it just for the joy of it, I feel makes us richer. So I think there is an element of nourishing the heart. And I find as we grow older, good decisions are a good combination of listening to the head and the heart. And we often say, listen to the heart. I think it's more of it's not so much a listening problem, but the problem is heart is not being cultivated because people haven't had the time to cultivate it. So that's why I think even L helps you at least nourish that. And I think that takes time. The third is, I think, as I said, having somebody else to reinterpret, to sort of make sense of what you're going through could help. I mean, I don't want to give a long list, but I think if people can pause, and also the last point maybe, since you mentioned, is wear your identities loosely. I go back to the cover, and each hat is a different identity. I find that very often we assign labels to ourselves, and that can be a cage. I'm a mechanical engineer. If I'd worked with that mind frame, then that would have been a very narrow set of options. I'm a consultant. I'm a management consultant. I'm a search consultant. At every stage, I think if we can sort of, James Clear was on the podcast, he said, especially during transitions, keep your identity small. Let's say if you're an army officer, rather than saying I'm an army officer, say, I'm very disciplined about pursuing a bunch of things, and I can lead in low visibility, high stress situations. Then that opens up a slightly wider canvas of possibilities. So try and wear your identities loosely to sort of to create new possibilities. Otherwise, if you've been on a railroad, it's difficult to open up to new pathways.
I think this will segue nicely into Meghnad's question. So Meghnad is saying one of the realities in India is the way your neighbors and your relatives interact with you post your announcing that you're retired.
Correct.
The way they interact with you is very different from when you had a high profile designation.
Correct.
Any thoughts on how to address this reality?
No, I'll give a very specific example, right? My father-in-law retired as a brigadier in the Indian Army. At some point, he was the post commander of the National Security Guard, the Black Cat Commandos, NSG. So when he retired as a brigadier, it was a big vacuum, right? And especially in the army, as Pramod, you married into that context as well. You have a large home, you have people to help you, you have resources. And he did go through that period of, if I may say, identity vacuum. But over time, he realized that what gave him joy was actually study of geopolitics, right? So slowly he started writing some pieces for defense journals. And then he opened a Twitter account and started putting out his views on geopolitics. And then suddenly journalists started following him. And suddenly they started calling him for interviews about India versus Pakistan, the China issue, et cetera, et cetera. And today he says, I don't have enough time in the day. There's so much happening between Russia and Ukraine and the Middle East and so on. And it's not earning him any money, but there's a sense of self-worth and joy and meaning and contribution to the world along the lines of what gives him joy.
Yes.
Right. He ran a securities business briefly. He says, I'm an army officer. Where am I distinctive? I'll provide a securities business. And he sort of they used to contract with organizations and provide security, but quickly realized that didn't bring him joy. It was a business. But if I look at where he is today, I feel he spends his time reading, writing, contributing, engaging on debates on Twitter. People from Russia suddenly tweet to him saying, your point on this is great. And unfortunately, I don't have that much interest in geopolitics, so he doesn't have a sparring partner at home. But it brings him joy. So I think I bring it back to saying, yes, retirement is often a steep fall from the cliff. But if we can sort of go deeper into what gives us joy and maybe go on the dating process, try a few things, some things emerge, and then you sort of lean into that and move from there.
Meghnadji, I think I'll strongly echo what Deepak is saying there. I've seen several of my relatives go through this, and those who are happiest in retirement are those who, as Deepak said, sort of date and find new identities, new realities. And as I think, Meghnadji, as you're saying in your own question, what our relatives and our neighbors say, it's whatever they say. Log kuch to log kahenge.
Exactly.
Logon ka kaam hai kehna. It's up to us to reinvent our identities, and those who do it tend to have very happy retirements in India. I think social media in this regard is a positive.
True.
Social media in this regard is a positive. It gives you a new identity.
True, and it gives you a window to interact with the world in something that you enjoy.
Nice point. I hadn't thought of this until you brought it up. So there's plenty of questions coming through. Pramod, do you have to make a call on how many we take? I think you clearly ignited many minds. The questions are now following. Well, up to you. How many?
Yeah, we'll take perhaps a couple of last questions. There's a very interesting question as a follow-up to your answer to Jagdish is, for a sparring partner in self-development journey, how does one get access to someone like Deepak? For example, is an AI version of Deepak with all your personal data fed into it a possibility? Is it even an option?
It's a great idea.
It's a good question. I was talking to my brother-in-law, who was the CEO of Xiaomi, Murli Krishnan, and he was actually suggesting that to me when I was talking to him, saying you should consider, and I think some people have done it, like Marshall Goldsmith has, along with Fractal, has come up with a bot, which
Marshall Goldsmith bot.
His bot, which sort of distills his wisdom and based on your context will provide contextual responses. So I think there's something that, and clearly I don't have the experience of a Marshall Goldsmith, but I think there's wisdom from the podcast that can be leveraged to context. So I think the short answer is, I think technologically, I think it's a need and it is feasible, but hopefully I'll get there at some point.
Right. And the last thing from Mr. Dinesh Gupta, how do you think about the people who influence you in your life? And how do you ensure you take that? I think you referred this in your book as well, role models. If you could just elaborate that in the context of flavor.
Yeah, lovely. So I find that this is something I learned from Rama Bijapurkar, who's one of the leading thinkers in the context of Indian consumer. I had her on the podcast as well. And in some segment of the conversation, when I was talking to her about choices, she said at some stage, one of my mentors said, who are your role models? And I thought of who they were. And in a way, that gave me clarity on what mattered to me. And her point was, actually, it's much harder for us to say, these are my values. But it's much easier for us to say, I admire ABC. And these are strangely enough, these are the common traits of ABC, and that's what matters to me. In her case, she said she liked a professor in a Western business school. She liked a lawyer, and she liked a Hindustani artist, a classical artist. And she said, when I looked at them, all of them were solo performers. So I quickly came to realization that actually large corporate roles is not meant for me. And I discussed that in the book as well. So in a way, for me, for example, one of my, the three people I talk about in the book, one is David Attenborough. Second is a gentleman called Alex Sebastian, I think. He's a stand-up comedian, Alexander Babu, sorry, who's a stand-up comedian. But what I like about him is he was a software engineer in the US. He came back, did his soul searching, and he's got a skill in music as well. So he has a stand-up act, which is a unique combination of humor and music. So I find he sort of figured out his skill stack, and he's sort of operating at the intersection of, he's found a unique product which leverages his skill stack. And the third is actually a movie character that I talk about, which is Robin Williams' character in the movie Good Will Hunting.
Oh, wow.
And that's the character which actually inspired me to become a coach, right? Where you say, I mean, he has a classmate from his high school who's a successful professor, who's in tenure and who's going after the big prizes. But Robin Williams actually does the hard work to figure out what matters to him and leads a life which is authentic. So I find that very often for example, when I think about David Attenborough, it occurred to me that playing the long game mattered. What I love about David Attenborough is actually he'd taken one piece to focus on and stayed with it for 4 or 5 decades or longer, right? So in a way, coming back to the question, what I find is role models often tell us what we care about. And that's a useful opportunity to reflect. Very often we treat role models as people to emulate, but actually they are a useful window into who we are in terms of what our values are and what matters to us. So I think that's an opportunity for people to work with.
Yeah, fabulous. I think you have an entire chapter on tuning into values and principles, which allows us to get into that flow mode and be authentic.
Correct.
Deepak, thank you very much. The book was transformational, but I hope a lot of people will take away things from this podcast.
And folks, also Deepak's done at the end of each chapter, there's a QR code. So if you shine your camera on the QR code, Deepak videos emerge, right? You can.
So there are videos of the 6 journeys I profiled, and there are audio inserts from the podcast on some specific insight. If you want to go deeper, just that piece of nugget.
So it's a rich book. You're not only paying for the kind of physical version. There's virtual material that you'll also get. Thank you so much for your time and for your wisdom, Deepak.
Thank you for the curiosity and the interest.
Saurabh was asking prior to this interview about your favorite podcast. There are hundreds of them, I know, but if you were to name 3 that we must listen because you enjoy doing it.
Of course. I think one is with a gentleman called Vinay Sitapati. He's a brother of a dear friend of mine. Sudhir Sitapati has written the foreword. He's a batchmate from mine. Vinay.
Famous author, no?
Yeah, he's written a book called Half Line about Narasimha Rao. And that's one of my most treasured conversations. It's just so rich with insight because it's all about leadership under constraints. How Narasimha Rao really assembled that cabinet, held on to power, how agile he was, how he went on a reflection process. That's like a gold mine. I learned so much from it. That's sort of one of my favorites. The second I would say was Vishy Anand. Just sort of the getting into the plumbing of the mind, how the conscious and the subconscious works, how the mind works during sleep. How do you sort of deal with the messiness of the human brain and sort of work with it to sort of really achieve excellence? So that's the second conversation that stands out for me. The third I would say is with Dr. Ram Guha. I spoke to him about Gandhiji. And I think it was just, I learned so much about, for example, one of the metaphors he uses is Gandhiji treated his life as a pianist. Each identity, for example, there'll be different times where he'll play a different tune where a certain identity would come forward. Like he was a freedom fighter, he was a journalist, he was a crusader, whatever. There were multiple identities he wore, but the way he juggled those identities and moved forward is like truly inspiring. So I think many to choose from, but if I had to pick 3, it would be these 3.
3 titans of Indian life. Thank you so much, Deepak.
And we can access your podcast on playtopotential.com, Spotify.
So Spotify and Apple have the sort of the full conversations unfiltered. But if you want specific nuggets, there's a membership option at playtopotential.com.
Thank you.
Best of luck. Thank you, folks. Thank you for your time. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.